Hi there, I'm Francis Vigent, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Judy Higgins and Lori Colpoys. We'll be discussing Mindset 6 of Cultures of Thinking and Action by Dr. Ron Ritchhart. The title of this chapter is Learning and Thinking are as much a collective enterprise as they are an individual endeavor. If you're in possession of the book, it would be good to take a look at pages 125 to 146, either in advance of this discussion or along with it. If you are doing that, we'd encourage you to capture your thinking, but you can use this following model as an example, noting your connections with what's in the reading, with your experience, any of the author's ideas that you'd challenge, concepts you think are worth considering, or challenges that the author is or changes the author is suggesting folks like us should consider making. If you are engaged by this discussion and would like to use it with your team, please visit KnowAtom.com where you can get a copy of today's recording, but also the slides and some of these reflection questions as well. So jumping right in here, our first quote is from page 125. We're built to collaborate. Neuroscience has shown that it feels good and that we release oxytocin when we're connected and acting in alignment with others. Furthermore, ideas get better when they're challenged, discussed, explored, and generally given a good workout. And yet, schools tend to see learning as an individual endeavor built on compliance and competition and punctuated by awards, prizes, and levels of attainment. This is particularly prevalent in the United States, where the prescription for success was and is a blend of pioneer spirit, self-assertion, individual ingenuity, and individual effort. Here again, we see the grammar of schools reinforcing traditional roles for students and teachers. And the first question, sort of questions that we were reflecting on, is what distinguishes a true learning group from group work or just team assignments? How does classroom culture play a role in that? No, Judy or Lori, if you'd like to start us off here.
Yeah, I really like that phrase. Ideas get better when challenged, discussed, explored, and given a good workout. And I think that's kind of the end game, isn't it? Helping
Mhm.
students understand and experience that. Little funny when he says schools see learning as individual endeavors, as an individual endeavor. I wonder if, I guess that's a little bit of a challenge for me, in that I think cooperation, collaboration skills has really come to the forefront, especially accountable talk and all that in the last 10 years. So I was a little surprised by that. But I do see the kind of the other side of that, the awards and the prizes and things like that, that I've always had such aversion to and negative emotions towards. So I
Mhm.
still think that sort of plays a role in schools. So what I kind of glean from this in my own experiences, what kind of distinguishes a true learning group from group work or team assignments is really more a mindset shift with kids and with teachers, perhaps. Um, I've mentioned this before, but I in my classroom that I shared with students at the beginning of the year, and they were my beliefs about learning, and my hope was that they would kind of become their beliefs as well. And one of the things on the poster was something, I don't know the exact wording, it's been a few years, but something like we can do more and learn more when we work together, when we're willing to work together. So sort of building that understanding in students. So back to that question, what distinguishes is it's not just divvying up work or assigning roles, but really about a mindset that as a collective group we're stronger together.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, one of the things that, yeah, I like that, Laurie, what you said. One of the things that was interesting to me was thinking about, I've been teaching for so long that when we started sort of going from individual work into group work, that I'm not sure it was a whole lot better to be doing group work because it was that assigning a role, or you do that piece and I'll do this piece. And the other person will do this piece. So there wasn't a collaboration because I finished my piece and so I'm done. And now you finish your piece. And we weren't talking about how the pieces went together. And I think that's what I saw as changing that mindset in that group work is, and Laurie, I loved that too, of thinking about playing with whatever we're learning, taking it apart, putting it back together, challenging it, thinking about all those things that we're learning and being able to challenge each other, because that was something that in group work, I didn't realize it until I really thought about collaboration years into group work, but we're not challenging each other. We're just accepting that part is done. And when students would come to present their piece, a group would present 4 different pieces as opposed to here's what our collaboration created. Here are the conclusions we came to. It was more a sense of, I learned this piece. Not sure what he was doing with his time, but this was my piece.
Yeah, so like group work could, to me, is like a discussion. It's not like an end, doesn't have to be a project or an end piece. To me, collaboration, true group work could be a discussion where
Yes.
you're pushing each other on the ideas that are being presented.
Mhm. It's
And
funny. Oh, sorry, God.
and you're connecting all the pieces of, if you did individual work, now we're going to get together and connect. What does your piece have to do with my piece? And what kind of conclusions are we going to come to?
One of the things I was thinking about in this context, well, just in directly answering the question, I really do think that there's the group work is a task is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. And I think that's what you were describing earlier, where everybody sort of has some piece and we're trying to bring those pieces together. Um, I remember as a student myself, like prior to teaching, we would do community service activities and clean up the, facilities of a nonprofit or, do things like this. And and I think about it as like we did those things. It was a it was work for our group. Did we get personal value from doing it? We did, but I'm not sure that the group as a whole emerged from that experience particularly stronger because everything was so compartmentalized. Each of us was responsible for some piece, and it kind of goes back to that sort of work model of teaching and learning as opposed to the um, more thinking, I think, model where we're really trying to process something as a group. Um, and really build something as a group. And the thing is it's not 30 students making 30 different things, but it's actually 30 students contributing to the creation of a single thing in a way. And that might be a collective understanding about what something is. Um,
Yeah,
and
focus on
yeah.
ideas rather than a product.
Yeah, exactly. And and that I guess I'm sharing that in relation to what you two were just sharing because it wasn't something that I had thought about until now. But when I originally looked at this and looked at these questions, what came to mind was as a teacher, I was thinking about Socratic dialogue, scientific discourse in my classroom, and I was thinking about students working with their partners, developing their plans for their labs. And I was thinking about how this chapter sort of sets up that that we're that there's like the I, and that's the individual, or this is what I was sort of picturing. It's like the I and the you and the we. And so the we is the collective, but I, as an individual within that collective, I have ideas, and so don't each of you as individuals in the collective. So so there's a relationship that's built between me and you, but also the group. And and I was thinking about this, and I was thinking how what we're really talking about, and I was thinking, and this is what made me think so much about Socratic dialogue and planning. labs is that in our classrooms, students are building relationships. They're learning how to build relationships and they're learning how to use relationships as funds of knowledge. Because I think oftentimes the approach to funds of knowledge is that students come from a particular geography or experience set and so on, and it's really rooted in the individual. But I think that those funds of knowledge are actually something much bigger. I think that it's that the relationships that we have within our group open funds of knowledge in other students that we can access, and that in a way that we kind of build that collective knowledge set that we from the I's and the U's, and that becomes a much greater and more refined sort of understanding or knowledge set. And and when I was thinking, I appreciate that this quote points out this somewhat unique to, I think, Western world. Here it says the United States, but that the prescription of success is this blend of pioneer spirit, self-assertion, individual integrity, and individual effort. It's this, it's really a focus on the I. Um, but if you think about it with the relationships, like that
That's important,
individualism, yeah, it does, right? Like that
right? It
individualism
relates.
is important.
Right. You bring that spirit to the group.
Right. But it's
Yeah.
balancing it, right? Like it's as an
Right.
individual learning how to, in a way, like if you think of the I as like an ego in a way, like
Mhm.
how do I balance my ego? How do I balance my own power to build a relationship and not overwhelm the other participant as a way of understanding and honoring their contribution, but also as a way of building the collective knowledge set. And I think that's, I think that's a really deep thing that I don't think this shows up on the radar in education much at all, because I think oftentimes as a teacher, I'm so focused on trying to get my student proficient at an individual level that this idea of the, relationship between students, but also this collective gets kind of lost. But even if, and this is what I think about, like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think it's there. I think it's a fine. It's hard in a classroom, and I know Judy, you've recently been in the classroom, you'll have kids who are opposed to group work. And that's why I said it's a mindset shift
Yeah.
because, I taught fourth grade for many years. I taught sixth grade too, but I think more so even in fourth grade, I think by sixth grade they become a little more social. I think in fourth grade I always had kids that were very adverse to learning in groups. They wanted to be alone. Um, and I always had to work really hard to, you know, promote the idea of, we're stronger together and that what you have can enhance what they have and what they have can enhance what you have. And I certainly saw that in labs, where you'd have those few difficult kids who it was their way or the highway kind of thing. Um, so I think teachers understand and I think especially in the last, few decades, that notion of group work, but I think it's tricky and it takes a skill set in itself from
Mhm.
teacher and student.
Well, and I think it's a lot of people, not just students, grown-ups. I mean, I think of group work I've done as a grown-up and have left things feeling like, I don't know, I did a lot of work and I didn't get any credit for that. And having to think about, again, what's our goal? And I think that's why a lot of students don't like group work. They feel like, well, I'm really intelligent and I want to be noticed as that. And still leaving a group and them feeling I did all the work and having to help again. And I think we need to take a lot of time thinking about this at the beginning of every school year of what is my group like and how am I going to continue to look at solving a problem together? And that we all have a part in that and we can all honor those parts,
Mhm.
but feel the importance of solving something together. And that is a difficult mindset because it's not like that. When you look at a lot of sports, it's hard to take away, that person was the greatness and that person gets all the attention. And there are all these other people working behind that. I think about that with football a lot. There seems to be these superstars and all these people that are supporting that person aren't necessarily getting noticed. And I think that's something hard that we have to work against in helping. What does it look like, sound like, act like to be truly collaborating?
Yeah, something struck me, Judy. You said, I want to be noticed. The kid that says, well, I want to be noticed. And that's what I mean by a mindset shift. And that's why I'm always so adverse to awards and prizes. And how ironic in my school for years and years and years, when I taught sixth grade, we gave out a citizenship award. And the irony was not lost on me. Like one person, gets hated it. My
Yes,
colleague and I worked for years to get rid of it because we were highlighting one student as a good citizen. How absurd is that?
yes,
And to be a good citizen, that requires more than yourself. It was just, I hated it. But I think that's, and I think in today's world, Judy, you're right. What do I get out of this? How am I going to be recognized?
yeah.
Right.
And that's exactly what I mean by a mindset shift, is that whole notion of you're stronger together.
Yeah.
I also, though, and my experience resonates with what Judy shared in terms of a lot of, I would have students who did not want to engage in group work because they had ideas that they wanted to push forward that were their ideas, and they didn't want to collaborate and compromise with another student or be held back in some way or something like this. And I always partnered those students with students like themselves because the rule was we had to compromise. You're going to have different ideas. You're going to have to figure out how how to come to one idea using your using pieces of the ideas that you have together. And I think that yes, it's a mind shift, um, but it's also a skill set that we need to be building in students. What I worry about getting lost with that when that mind shift hasn't happened is that a student could be number one in every possible way. But only if they only exist at this individual level, they are going to be completely limited by that. Because if you kind of think about innovation, or you think about like how ideas germinate and become companies, or they become, whatever, even if there's something in your school, like maybe you want a new playground or you're going to build a new building and you think that having a certain style of classroom is the most important thing. Your idea and your brilliance as an individual doesn't really matter because the collective is going to kind of you have to be able to work with the collective in order to move that agenda forward or in order to have that idea propagate in some way. So you may be right, but if everybody else thinks that the playground should be across the street and you function only well as an individual, then the collective that thinks it should be across the street is going to get it across the street. And that may be suboptimal outcome. And I think that like that skill set this is where it starts. And I think my big takeaway here was around class culture. It's like, what do we value in our class? Because I think that's the shift. It's like, and I think about again, elsewhere in the chapter, it's like ways of being gets brought up. We've talked about norms and sort of there's the relationship drawn here later in the chapter between ways of being and norms. But it's like, as a class, as a collective, what do we value? How do we help each other? And how do we help each other win as a class? And I think that's the thing. It's not competing with each other, but It's creating this thing, this understanding together. And then hopefully that gives students this kind of experience and skill set to be able to win with a team, because that's kind of, I think, what we're doing in a way with this, right? Or maybe
Right.
winning maybe not be the right analogy, but
But so,
That's kind of what I did with my poster, in the beginning of the year, my beliefs about learning that I wanted to sort of hopefully have them believe as well. It was all in shaping classroom culture. Some very first day, we would talk about how we're stronger together, and I would build activities around that so that they could see and feel that. So I think you're right. I think it is culture, and I think it takes a lot to build it and create it and you know, coming together each year as a sort of a new family of students. You've got to work to pull them together and work as a team.
Mhm.
Lori, can you give, because what I'm thinking about now is how. So can you give an example of what you do? Because I'm thinking about one thing I saw, it wasn't my classroom, I saw it in another classroom, and it was dazzling to me, was a student in another group had a thought that didn't pertain to what his group was doing, because they were
Mhm.
building something different. And I just happened to be walking around and just happened to notice this. And he said, "Oh, wait a minute, I have a really good idea for that group." And he ran across the room and said, "You were having trouble with this. Have you thought about trying that?" And then and then they left the group. And I was like, that is so amazing, because he's not just supporting his own little group. He's got a brilliant thought for another group that he's giving to them. And I remember telling the teacher about it and just saying, how did you create this dynamic that kids would be so thoughtful that they would share something even beyond that was for the greater good of another group? And he wasn't going to get any credit for that, not even collaborating within that group. And I noticed it. So I commented, I said, that was so generous of you, and asked him why he did it. And it was really cool. But I'm interested to think, what kind of activities do you do to sort of start that mindset change?
Yeah, I think so. We had lots of team. Of course, I always had morning meeting as well, which was always a great opportunity. And we did have a lot of team building activities. I was just telling Francis yesterday, we did this thing where we did card communities with old library cards, where they together had to build this massive card community, house of cards, where they connected and it filled the room. And it was all about look what we created together. So it's sort of in the beginning of the year, setting the notion of what it means to be a community and working together. But then even Judy, like when you were just giving that example, naming and noticing, like when a teacher names and notices,
Yeah.
I really like how you blah, 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 and that helps us do this. And like that poster I had in the room, I would reference it all year long. It wasn't just this thing I slapped up in the beginning of the year, but it was like, look at what we just did together. Remember this mind, I think I called them like philosophy of my room, but remember this statement? This is us doing that. This is so naming and noticing, I think, is huge for a teacher. Pointing it out, bringing it to the forefront so kids go, oh, that is what I just did. Oh, and that did help them.
And I also like what you said about beginning of the year, because I commented on this in a later slide that we'll do, but I think so often teachers get, you know, I'm looking at all these overwhelming pacing guides, and I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And forgetting about, take the time at the beginning, because you'll make it up later, to work on these cultures, because otherwise you'll never quite get there, and you're always trying. So I think that to help teachers recognize, take the time. It's okay. If you get a little bit behind, you'll catch up. This is such important work to
It
start
really is.
recognizing.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I think that gets right to what this quote is about on slide 2, is the concept of collective is useful in understanding the basis from the mindset. Douglas Thomas and John Seeley Brown use the term collective as opposed to group or community to denote a collection of people, skills, and talent that produces a greater result than the sum of its parts. They stress the active, goal-oriented, and participatory nature of the collective. And I think we've already both touched on this question. How could this distinction impact teacher pedagogy? I think that the sum is greater than the parts is, I think, sometimes tricky to kind of in a tangible sense as a teacher to kind of wrap your arms around, because I feel like the orientation oftentimes as a teacher is what am I going to do? What are they going to do? Or, what do I do? What does a student do? And that makes it sort of very individual and very
I,
compartmentalized.
I kind of zoned in on active and goal oriented. So when I think of pedagogy, so when you're building lessons and planning units, thinking about what routines you've established for processing ideas together. Where's the rigor and the challenge that's going to be required for true learning groups? How does the activity that you planned lend itself to group learning?
Mhm,
So, what systems do you have for inclusion so that all voices are being heard? So, again, kind of going back to that goal-oriented and participatory nature. So, taking a look at a lesson from that lens.
mhm. Well, and I think what you're talking about is reflection too. I think really reflecting on tasks as a collective learning opportunity. How are we managing that? How are we assessing that? It's going to be different. So it takes that reflection, and I feel like thinking about my actions as a teacher and how they're going to enhance the collective experience as opposed to an individual's experience or enhancing the completion of the task. Like I can have kids check in with me and I can tell them what to do, and that will, I guess, enhance the experience of completing the task or getting a particular outcome. But that sort of pedagogy is not what we're talking about here. So it takes that kind of reflection on what the interactions are going to be like, I think. And I
Right.
think like the last piece, if I can just add on, is like I think it also kind of begs the question is what is successful student engagement? Because I feel
Student
like that.
sharing and yeah, processing ideas together, right? With an openness and an eye toward the common good, like the book says. Isn't that what we're striving for?
Perhaps,
Yes.
but like, how do we get there?
Well,
Without
Yeah.
reflecting, you know?
one of the
Yeah.
things that I thought about was in KnowAtom when I started utilizing checkpoints and having students check in together and giving them the message that you all have to come with some thoughts here. You all have to bring understanding. And that was such a changer in my classroom because I was just simply giving that message. It wasn't, and they learned it simply was, well, you and your partner, I'm not sure, are you in agreement? Are you both understanding this? Are you both, agreeing on next steps? And that was such a wonderful way of, well, no, apparently we're not. Thought it was okay because she knew what she was doing here. And that was just so great because it was just a very simple, well, you're not quite ready to go on. No big deal, just go back and figure this out. So I think that those kinds of routines were a wonderful game changer and mindset changer in my classroom when students recognize that we're not ready to go up. I have lots of thoughts, but my partner on my team isn't aren't all understanding. So we all have to get our thoughts together before we go up for our checkpoint. So I think that was part of it in my classroom, setting up these routines that we stopped and started at particular points. And that way, as a teacher, then that was great for me because I had an understanding what groups were working well, what groups might I need to be paying more attention to, what groups were ready to, that I could release some responsibility. And that felt so wonderful because it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from, here's the next steps. I can move on, or my team has some work to do.
And navigating that frustration, Judy, right? That inevitably happened. Because
Yeah.
it does. It's just that's the way it is, That's the nature of group work, is there's at times going to be frustration. And as the teacher, how you navigate that and help them, through that.
Right. Right.
That, I think, brings us to the next slide here. And we can kind of continue in this thread if you would like. But what makes an effective collaborative group? Of course, there is not a single answer to this important question, but research points to several factors that we might consider and try to realize. Jerome Brenner identifies 4 factors at play in communities of learners. Just real quickly, the first, agency, taking control of one's learning. Second, reflection, making the learning make sense. Third, collaboration, sharing the human resources of all those involved in the mix of teaching and learning. And fourth, culture, the way of life and thought that we construct, negotiate, and establish. How can I help my students understand and practice each of these factors?
I think one of, sorry, Francis, did you have a thought?
No, I had one. Mine's very short about this. There's a quote with it later in the text that says essentially the quality of discussion shows you the quality of engagement.
Mhm.
And I think knowing as a teacher how hard it is to get students into discussion, I think it shows how hard it is to really engage students at a quality, really successfully and at a quality level until you get, I think until you get your own lens aligned in such a way, and then I think it becomes relatively easy. But I think I remember as a first year teacher myself that we didn't have quality discussions, we didn't have quality engagement, and we didn't have these 4 things. We had little pieces of it. So I don't know, that just, I guess, spoke to me. Sorry, Judy, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine, because that's a really good point. Number one just really struck me, agency, taking control of one's learning. And I like that one so much because I think so often students they don't think they have control of their learning often. And that was such a powerful thing to me when I could have a discussion with students about when we're having a conversation, the conversation isn't just for people who understand everything, because that seemed to be what would happen. The kids who understood it, they would run the discussion, everybody else would let them, they know everything. And it was so interesting. And I would find this year after year, classroom after classroom, that students almost needed permission to come into a discussion with a question. It is okay to say, this was really confusing to me. Can somebody help? Was anybody else confused by this? I thought this meant that, and now I don't know. And the power of that, of helping students understand that that's a very powerful thing to do. And that's your power. There's nothing to be ashamed of. And I think that's one of the things that is so important for teachers to model. Wow, I don't know that either. Ooh, can anybody help me with that? I wonder where I could find out that again. utilizing that curiosity to learn more, not to hide my curiosity, because that's what I did so much. I have to hide that, and maybe I can figure it out later, but I am so far behind the rest of the group. Instead of utilizing the group, this can help me. And that was such a fun and powerful thing to help students understand. This is how you control your learning. Ask questions, be curious, poke around a whole lot, and suddenly helping students tune into their own learning. Like, oh, wait, I just learned that. Oh my gosh. Now that's making me connect with that and getting that joy that they talk about often throughout this book, like what happens within the brain when we're learning, when we're curious, when we're excited by all those things. And that is such a powerful thing to start helping your students and your cohorts and your teachers understand.
That's so cool, Judy, because something I wrote down was when I think about effective collaborative groups was respect and recognition for what others bring to the table. But how important of what you just brought up is that I bring something important to the table too. I being maybe that fourth grade student that's shy and doesn't want to speak or doesn't see themselves as a contributor. It makes me think of that street data that comes later in the chapter where kids didn't view themselves as bringing something to the table. So it's kind of funny when you think of taking control of one's learning. That sounds very singular, but so important for the group. You know, you have to participate, you have to share. Francis, and I know when you were talking about collaboration and skills, I love that part of the book where they use the metaphor, so easily shareable with kids about group conversation. And they use that metaphor of the ice cream cone versus popcorn. So, and I know early in the year that tends to be what discussions are like, just popcorn of ideas, sort of disconnected. And of course, you want them to be adding on and building on each other's ideas, which is more like the ice cream cone, which I think is such a great metaphor to share with kids and something they could easily understand.
Hmm.
So when you
Well,
think of an effective collaborative group, you know, if you're doing that popcorn method, it's not you're not going to get anywhere.
right. Well, and I think too, so much of this quote and what we're talking about really speaks to the kind of environment that we're creating in the classroom. And I think one of the things as a teacher in an urban setting, as I remember, I started my career as a high school math teacher, and I had students that were within a year of my age, which was like, kind of an interesting situation to be in because like I always tell people, it's like, they were asking me if they could go to the bathroom, and I had, a pension plan and a job and a degree and like all this sort of stuff. And it was like a weird experience for me. But in looking at the students that were coming into my class at that point, they had been through 8, 9, 10, 12, 13 years of not having agency sometimes because of the culture of the classrooms that they had been in. They were not being engaged in reflection. People, adults that were in charge of their learning, in a sense, on paper, as teachers, were not seeing them as capable of collaboration or that the collaboration was a threat to the teachers, control there. So the product of all of that was that these children had been in a toxic culture of learning, and it made my job really hard because to try to take a child that has been shown every day for years and years and years that the way that they move on in a school is to sit back, don't cause trouble, don't, do this, don't do that, don't do that. They really didn't know how They knew what not to do. I think they had a sense of that by other people's definition, but they didn't have a good sense of what to do to help themselves. And I think it colored the school experience as something that was just not for them and not very valuable. And it made my job terrible because I had to try to fight against that, to try to recreate it to redefine all of these things. And it quite frankly felt like something I couldn't do. And I don't think I was successful in doing that. And I think that this next slide, I think kind of speaks to that. And I think you both were just sort of beginning to touch on it. So I'll read this and get your thoughts here. So, through the process of explaining, defending, and discussing with one another, children make use of their peers' ideas as thinking devices, which enables them to reflect on and transform their own thinking. When students learn alongside their more experienced peers, opportunities to work together, brainstorm possibilities, pool knowledge and insights, conduct collective analyses, critique each other, and draw energy from a common goal allow for deep learning to take place. Through talking to one another, students co-construct new knowledge. The cognitive conflicts that arise serve as the power driving intellectual development. And our questions here were, how do I create a safe space in which all students are contributing? What teaching practices support or hinder collective learning?
I think for hindering, you think about whole group discussions are really a great place for collaboration. And I think practices that can really hinder this is the teacher talking too much and not listening to students carefully and asking maybe the wrong type of questions, narrow questions, or questions that you know the answer to. And I think, and we've talked about this on, at length on other slides, is that over scaffolding, oversimplifying tasks, being too helpful, answering questions for them stops them from going to their peers and collectively working out their thoughts and their question. That conflict that it talks about at the end of the quote, that's the power driving intellectual development. So certainly over scaffolding and answering questions for them would hinder that. I think for supporting it, it goes back to questioning, asking those facilitative questions that are going to generate thinking. And what we talked about earlier, when you're doing group work, naming and noticing when students are learning from one another, like we talked about, Judy, with that example. We could go on and on. Give somebody else a chance. I have a whole other list of things that could support it, but give you guys a chance to talk.
I think two that jumped out for me that I think that are both relatively simple. One is sentence frames, and that was another case with my starting with discourse and just, being so frustrated and, these are kids who never stop talking. Why are we hearing crickets now? But to recognize that a lot of students don't know how to come into a conversation or how to say something as simple as, could you repeat that? Could you give me an example? I asked Laurie for an example early on because that's often how I understand something. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but can you give me an example? And that's always, oh, okay, that's really helpful. So I think that introducing things like that, and I remember with my older grades, we would have fun with sentence frames because they might feel awkward because saying things like, I respectfully disagree. So many of my students would say, like, that sounds rude. That's mean. Say, no, it's not mean. That's, this is how you have a conversation and get your thoughts out and push things further. So I think that helping them with, and we often forget that, particularly in the older grades, we just assume, well, they talk all the time, they know how to do this. But to give them those things that are helpful. The other thing that I really had fun with this in my class because most of my students were English learners and some of them were really uncomfortable talking. So we used to practice helping each other talk. And one of my students did a really nice job once, and I always, because I would ask the students, how can we support each other? What's a good way for someone to invite you into the conversation? And one of my students said, well, if they really gave me a lot of help around what they wanted from me, if they were very specific. And so we started this routine of, and we practiced this a lot when we were sharing out after an investigation. And a student would say something like, well, Rose had a great thought about how to make the wheels more stable. Could you tell them about that, Rose? And that became a really, and again, at first, like the kids would kind of laugh and they felt sort of awkward doing it. But then it became a really safe way for them to bring somebody who was uncomfortable talking. They they fed it. Here's what I want from you. I know that you can do this. Because I would always talk about, you don't want to throw anybody under the bus with, if they're already feeling uncomfortable about speaking in a group. You don't want to just throw a question at them if they're not confident. So building in something like that they had just done, it had worked, they knew what they were doing, and they were ready to talk about that. So I think helping them with those ways of having a discussion that will create a safe space. Nobody's going to try to make me look some way that I don't want to look.
And I think to piggyback on that, Judy, also, in addition to those things, just giving them time to process and organize and rehearse their thoughts, preparing for a discussion ahead of time or giving wait time or, doing a turn and talk or the 1, 2, 4 all. So they have that little rehearsal, they can feel a little more confident
Yeah.
in sharing.
And even at the older grades, because I think that's what
Yeah.
happens is when they get more, we assume they're going to be better at older grades, but they're way more, threatened by the whole thing. It's not like the kindergartners that's a different issue with how do I stop this conversation and make it more productive? That's a slightly different thing that the teacher has to do. But yeah, helping them create a safe space.
It's kind of interesting. Did you guys see that part in the book? Notice that part in the book where it talked about, giving space and time to share your thoughts. But when it comes to problem solving, preparation isn't as necessary and could actually hinder the process because kids are more likely to hold on to what they have if they have time to think of it. And then they're more likely to come, the more able would be more likely to come with solutions. And the less able would just defer to it. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes.
Yes.
I lived that. Yes, you're right. And that was on me because sometimes I would give them perhaps some time to process when we were problem solving and it would backfire just like that.
Yeah. That's
One
a
of
real
the
connection.
one of the things I noted on this was so in the context of helping or hindering, certainly I think hindering overprotecting students can hinder them, and I think that's a great example. Like we want to protect students by giving them the time to solve the problem and so on and so forth, and then come to the group, but it can work against us, right? I think in certain contexts, I think that allowing students to learn on the job is really important. I think giving them that dynamic so that they're all on the same on a level field, and I think that that's really what that quote you're referencing, Lori's talking about is let all the kids come to the problem at the same moment in a level field, and then use that collective dynamic or the culture of your classroom and a collective dynamic to help give students the opportunity to problem solve that way. And I think you both touched on it earlier, which was something that I had jotted down in relation to this was, and Laura, you and I talked about this quite a bit the other day, community building. I think community building is huge here. And I think about, I don't know, I think I would much rather be generalist teacher teaching science with one group of students than a specialist teacher teaching science the same, you know, whatever, the same grade level 5 times a day. Um, because I feel like being able to build community with a group of students and draw that across all the disciplines and help students see learning as learning and not,
So
this is
true.
science and this is ELA. And I feel like this is a key breakdown that happens when children go to middle school and then potentially again when they go to high school is that they go from this self-contained model where hopefully a teacher is doing community building and then that is there it is a learning environment and then these different content areas pass through that environment and so we're just learning
Right.
we're learning this now, we're learning that now, but we're, the skills, the habits, the so on are are by and large common, right? And so the idea that students go to middle school and they then switch between different people's expectations, they may be switching around in an environment where there isn't a community built because they're with different, particularly in high school, they may be with different kids in different classes and so
It's
on and
such a
so forth.
fragile age too,
It
right?
is exactly
It's
when you
such
think
a
about identity
critical
formation.
time in their learning socially. And
Hmm.
I've always thought that, like, what if the middle school model was different? I know, and I've shared this with you guys that I changed from sixth grade to fourth grade because our sixth grade was self-contained in an elementary school and it was being shifted to the middle school. And that's when I was like, I'm out. Like I want self-contained for those
Hmm.
exact reasons, Francis.
Hmm.
Um, it makes me wonder, should the middle school model be looked at? I get high school when, it's high level, you can't have a teacher be an expert in all those different areas, but
Hmm.
I
But it's,
think I
yeah,
think middle school is such a critical time.
exactly. And for such a short time, typically 3 years
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
in most cases. And in the history of K-8 schools as being quite common, like a
Mhm.
neighborhood school model, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but one other thing I noted on this, which is actually related to the ladder of feedback video, which I believe folks can access with their QR code in the book. But um, one of the things I found as a teacher that I had to really be careful of was validating comments and contributions from students because it can set up a sense of competition and judgment. For example, that I'm seeking a right answer. And I
So
and
true.
I yeah, and I thought that the ladder of feedback video, like somewhat tangentially related, the teacher, a student shares out what I would say was a criticism of another student's work in this ladder of feedback model. And the teacher called the student out essentially for judging the other student because it wasn't really a critique as much as a criticism. And there wasn't the evidence, there wasn't sort of the reasoning around what was being shared. And I just thought it was a very artful example of depersonalizing because I feel like that's part of the community building that needs to happen in things, particularly in science where but also even in ELA and elsewhere, like if you think of that Socratic dialogue model, for example, or something where students might be getting into scientific argumentation, having different ideas and using different evidence to support it, and they really are maybe polar opposite. Um, it can feel really personal. And I feel like that's one of those key things that if it feels personal, children shut down.
Yeah.
That's what I observed in my teaching. And so by helping students understand that and also frame what their feedback as well as their receiving the feedback from the perspective of, and I used to describe it to my students as clinical. This is not a criticism of you. This is a clinical look at an idea. And it could be anybody's idea. And just the fact that you grabbed that idea doesn't make it a reflection of you in particular. It just happens to be an idea that you've grabbed and you've shared. So when you hear feedback, know that know that it's not feedback about you personally. It's feedback about that idea. But also, as somebody sharing that feedback, you need to be mindful that there's a person who identified this idea, they're sharing this reasoning, and it's something that they took interest in or they saw value in. So we have to respect them as people and not make this personal and not make it seem that way. So I think that that is a really for me when I think about my fifth, sixth grade students in particular, like that was huge to getting students to share.
It's funny, one of the things I jotted down for practices that support, which totally relates to what you're just saying, Francis, is setting norms. So making sure the students know the goal of group work. And we talked about this the other day, Francis, when we were talking about something else, the ways of being, and I thought it was interesting. The book says, um, if the goal is merely to get the work done, the norm might be everyone has to do their part. But in contrast, if the goal is collective thinking through problem solving, the norm might be make sure you hear everyone's ideas. So I think in what you're saying, Francis, in helping students understand feedback, that's part of norm setting, and I think that's something else a teacher can do to make those things really overt and understood in their classroom.
Mm. The next slide, I think, um, touches on this as well, maybe in a slightly different way. As students share ideas and resources, they assume joint responsibility for learning. This creates a safe environment in which students view one another as allies rather than competitors, thereby increasing engagement and academic achievement. And our question here was, how does having an ally in learning change an individual learner's perspective on the purpose of school? And I think about my students in that first year of my teaching as having no allies. Like I think about those kids, they were trying to get through. Um, and I think about that dynamic that I showed at the very beginning where it was, the relationships. Like those children didn't have the skills, they had never been invited, there was never an opportunity to be able to create a relationship with another student and a collective, and in a sense, the teacher, like as a part of that collective. And what I love about this term allies is that I think about allies as, in a learning context, a source of support, a safe audience for being genuine and authentic. And I think also allies share, hopefully, I would hope in my class this was true, that we share goals, we share a purpose, we share values, and that creates a sense of belonging. And I think that in my early years, figuring out how to be a teacher, um, that was tough. I think it was a little lost on me.
Mm. I always think about the student that I saw at a very young age, and this wasn't my classroom, this was a classroom I was observing, but a group of, I think they were second graders working together on a project, and they had to come to an agreement. And this teacher had done a great job with, they understood how to do that and how to go back and forth, and they had to come to an agreement about before they placed their card in a certain place. And I remember, one student who just was very insistent, this is where she thought the card should be. And the other three students were, continuing to say, here are all the reasons why we don't agree. And they finally got her to agree. And she said, you changed my thinking. She literally used that, which obviously they had been well schooled in that. But she used it in such a way that she was delighted. It wasn't like, I've been beaten down, you guys did it, go ahead, put the card where you think it should be. She was absolutely delighted. And I thought, what an incredible, like, mindset for that. You gave me this gift of changing my thinking as opposed to, ugh, I surrender. And I think that's that mindset that is so incredible. Like, imagine if the world worked that
Yeah,
way.
right.
like we could truly have conversations, and that we've got 3 against 1 here, but they were continuing to, they weren't being bullying. They kept producing. Here's more evidence. Here's another thing that is showing us where we were. And it was all done with patience, with best intentions. And so I just remember thinking about what an incredibly safe space has been created here, that all this went on. No adult, I was watching, and boy, was it hard for me not to intervene because I was so dazzled by all of it. But no adult was coming to sort of like, ooh, I better fix this. And it, some real work has gone on in that classroom to get somebody who was so, she was very sure of her answer, and to be delighted by understanding at some level, like whether it was like, I wish I could have interviewed her to say, like, like, what happened? How did it feel when that happened? And, helping students more understand the delight of that. Like, what is going on with your brain when you just learned something that was so exciting? Like, I want to do more of that. I want to have more of these hard conversations, because it was a hard conversation for everyone, but they knew how to do it. They were up for that. And I thought, this is so great to be exposing young students to something like that. We're all in this together, and we know how to persevere with this. They had a lot of good tools that they had been taught in terms of, let's go back to the book, let's look at the picture, let's look at, they were doing like picture thinking in terms of, let's really look at the details in this picture to provide more evidence. So it was one of those that I saw years ago, and I'll never forget it. And I always think about it at times like this. It's like, yeah, that's how those things happen. That's having multiple allies in learning.
Funny, when I saw this question, I zoned right in on learner's perspective, and I'm like, what is the learner's perspective? Like thinking of my own classroom, like what were their perspectives? And I think it's kind of interesting that collecting street data section of the book, they always have that collecting street data. And I guess it goes back to what you're saying, Francis, is reflection. Like to begin with, what are their perspectives? It talks about the questions you can ask your kids, obviously for older groups, but it also had that functioning in group tool in the appendix. Did either one of you take a look at that? It's on page 263. It's something the teacher can reflect on. It's kind of like a checklist, but it has like behaviors of groups. And then you can see what behaviors are most prevalent, and, what factors are contributing to the patterns that you're seeing. And, of course, what questions or reflections does that data that you're collecting, does it evoke, So that's sort of where my mind went. I had trouble answering the question, but I thought about like, well, what are their perspectives? How do they view learning and their friends in the classroom?
Yeah.
I liked this question because in thinking about there is, I think, a significant number of students who have a learning experience that sort of mirrors hurdles on a track, where it feels like I start the year, I'm running to the end of the year, and my teacher is going to put these hurdles in front of me. And if I can jump over all of them and hit as few as possible, I'm going to get a good grade and move on. And, that's going to be kind of how it works. And that to me feels extremely individual, and it feels really, really limiting, because it feels like a tortoise and hare kind of story. It's not so much about the power of yet. It's more about the can you or can't you. And when you have an ally I think about as a student having an ally in my classmates and in my teacher and all of this. It feels more like a journey together where we're all trying to accomplish something together. And so my individual ability to get over any one hurdle doesn't matter because I've got somebody's got my back and I can get somebody else's back. And I think that's to me like really a powerful element of culture in a classroom is trying to create that or hopefully, creating it. But I don't know how you can do it without the allies. And I just think for students, I think it makes school seem really purposeful. It's like we're in something together, whereas I'm not just being measured against my ability to jump these hurdles.
Mm.
This was the I believe last quote that we had pulled together for this mindset. When teachers viewing, when teachers view teaching and learning to teach not just as an individual enterprise, but also as a collective endeavor, they're more likely to take risks, engage in innovative practices, develop a greater sense of efficacy, be more confident and empowered in their teaching, and increase their motivation. Not surprisingly, student outcomes also improve dramatically. So this quote looking at teachers and teachers, I think, as learners, how can members of was our question, how can members of a school or building promote collaboration that is characterized by inquiry, reflection, and examination of issues of teaching and learning?
I think it's hard because I think it begins with a belief that together, just like with the kids, you're going to be stronger and that together you can affect change as a community. I know they reference that research with soft collegiality versus hard. And the soft isn't gonna, they describe soft as storytelling and sharing and assisting, helping your colleagues, um, which of course probably isn't going to get you there, right? But I think in addition to having that belief, if the belief isn't there, I'm not sure how it's going to work, but it's just constructing a vision together,
Mm.
um, doing some purpose-driven work with a team you trust and making that's where it would begin, I would imagine, is having a vision together.
But I think it's all about time. Teachers have to have time to communicate and and create a vision, not time when you have lunch together and it's just kind of, ugh, everything is really hard and I'm frustrated, but real time to look at what is important, what is our purpose, because it's so hard to, you're so often alone in your classroom and don't have time to reflect on what's going well and what ideas can I get from another teacher? Or just like ask like that I could ask you that question at the beginning, Laurie. Say, well, give me an example of that. That sounds like what I want, but I'm not sure how. Tell me how you did that. And you told me how. And as a teacher, I would think, oh, I could do that. That's a really great idea. And to have support like that, this person gave me something that's working in her classroom, maybe I can try that. And I think that's the thing that gets missed. As teachers, we've got so many things that must be done and are priorities. And just like we often, at the beginning of the year, we're so driven by pacing guides. It's like, I don't have time to do all of this, get them ready for this. But that time is so well spent. Same with teachers. If we had time to watch each other teach, ask each other questions, get together with some sort of a vision and using each other's brains, because that, for me as a teacher, I would have treasured more time with other teachers. And the times that I did spend in other teachers' classrooms were so incredibly helpful whether it was to see something that made me think I could do that. Or even if I saw something like, well, I think that could be improved on, but I'm seeing, I'm seeing the why of that. And I really like a lot of what I'm seeing, and I have lots more questions.
I think kind of grassroots can work. Like I think it can begin in a teacher's room. I think it can begin in an after school conversation in the hallway in sort of my experience. And I think it goes beyond just sharing a cool thing that you're doing. Again, I think it kind of goes back to a vision of a change, change making.
Mhm.
Um,
But
I
again,
would
that's
go
fine
ahead.
because I feel like there's so much of, in my experience, there were so many things that like started in the lunchroom or started in the hallway, but
Mhm.
then I don't, we need time to, again, mess around with that, think about that, challenge each other, ask each other those questions. And I feel like as a teacher, there were so many years that, oh, well, we'll try that next year, or we'll get together next month. And then it just didn't happen. And I think that it takes a lot for a teacher to do that on their own. And for that to be recognized at a higher level, that teachers need real and regular time to
Mhm.
get together to think about that vision.
Mm.
Mhm.
And a vision is wonderful, but we need to, what are the steps to that vision? How are we going to get there? And that takes time. That takes, and all too often it's like, well, we can meet after school. Ugh, wouldn't it be nice if we could meet during school, when we're all there, that feels very special if you get time during school that you're out of your classroom and can be looking at that vision, seeking, a path to that vision.
Mhm.
Which is perhaps where your relationship with administration comes in too.
Mhm.
Percent.
Right? And the reciprocal respect between,
Mhm.
the administration and the teachers.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
things can take root and kind of grow.
And admin recognizing, just like as a teacher recognizes at the beginning, this is going to put me behind, but it's worth it to be teaching all these routines, and for admin to say, yeah, this is, hard, like taking teachers out of their classrooms, but boy, is it worth it in the long run to see what they're getting from it and what their students are getting from it.
It's interesting. There's a quote in the book someplace. I don't have it in front of me, but it's interesting. This quote says that people tend to view what is as the way that it's supposed to be. And what I think about in relation to what you're sharing is, and it's something that I understand why it happens, but I find it personally frustrating because a lot of the changes that made me more effective, I think all the changes, they didn't cost me anything. Like they were free. I just needed to think and act differently. It wasn't like I had to go out and buy a special tool or anything like that. I wasn't, it's not that I couldn't be more effective by having this sort of device. I could be more effective by doing something differently. And I think the point of frustration around the time debate sometimes is that, is it, would you like to spend your time doing something poorly, or would you rather spend your time doing that same time doing something well? And I think that it's exactly what you described. The barrier is the time investment to make the shift, to get the time to reflect, to get the time to try, the so on and so forth. And my reaction to this was really what kind of a teacher tribe is your school? Because I have to say, as I moved between schools as a teacher, but then later on in my role at KnowAtom, going, many, many schools. Um, Schools are tribes. They're tribal. And I remember as a teacher being in that urban school environment, and it was a tribe. It had a set of values. It had complaints, and so on and so forth. And people really organized around that. And I didn't feel like that wasn't my tribe. Like I didn't share that mindset. I I thought differently about kids. I thought differently about learning. And so later I made a switch to a different school, and I was part of a completely different tribe there. And I felt like the values were different. The vision was different. The complaints were different. Um, and so I guess in thinking about how we can promote collaboration and inquiry and reflection and all of this, I think, yes, I think it comes down to soft and hard collegiality. And as Judy and I have discussed too, it's a fine line because, and I think the soft collegiality builds the relationship to be able to engage folks in hard collegiality. You can't just walk in and hit people with the hard collegiality with no relationship because unless you're a member of that tribe, unless you're somebody who has that sort of call it social equity to be able to spend a little bit of it being critical of somebody in a way that might feel a little uncomfortable. Um, but when I think about the tribes, I think teacher tribes, to your point, Lori, there's a there's a vision, even if there isn't really a vision. That's the vision, and there's values. Maybe the value is that I don't work a minute over contract. Maybe the value is that when that bell rings, I walk out with the kids. That's a value. It might not be a great value. It might not be my value, but in some communities, that's a value. Um, what do we complain about? Do we complain about the kids? Do we complain about the families? Do we complain about trying to achieve these sort of things and not having the time to get together and discuss? Like those are very different kinds of complaints that talk about what we value and what our vision is. And are we as teachers, and speaking, I think to your point, Lori, about administration, who set who builds the tribe? Who maintains this tribe? It's the principal. It's whoever's making the hiring decisions. Who's the one that is reinforcing that it's okay to walk out with the kids. It's okay to walk in half an hour late and somebody's covering for you on a regular basis. Is the way that like I interact with as a teacher, because I've been in different environments, am I directed? You have to do this just this way. And so, if it's not, I'm going to walk in your classroom and you're going to be in trouble. Am I empowered as a teacher? I'm trusted to make decisions. And so, if my kids are loud, they're loud for a reason. They're not out of control. They're actually on task. Come see. And I know, Judy, you've shared that about inviting people in and helping people understand what to look for and kind of, what your thinking is about what's going on. Or are we abandoned? Because I've been a part of that environment too, and I've seen that environment where, you know what, it's every man for himself, person for themselves. You're not being directed, you're not being empowered, you're just being left alone to your own devices and hope you figure that out. Good luck. And so
So zero, no soft collegiality, no hard, just zero collegiality.
exactly, it's the warm body model, right? It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
hey, there's your class, there's the door, there's the books. And then I guess the last thing that I would just say about this that I was a thought of mine was I'm similarly to being frustrated in part by people accepting that things are the way they are because they're supposed to be this way. That I need to spend all my time doing these things because that's what I'm supposed to do. It leads, to those poor outcomes perhaps over potentially being able to do something more effectively. It's I get frustrated by teams that don't value or build capacity to reflect on things that are less concrete as a way of developing things that are concrete. Because I feel like that is so important. Like what we value as a team, what our vision is, like in a lot of ways, these are things that are very ethereal, maybe. If you want to prepare students for life, if you value critical thinking, if, all these sort of things, it feels very unrelated to a test, very unrelated to what kids need to be doing or whatever. Right now, it's not very concrete. But without developing that capacity in a team and actually spending that time, like how do we make concrete choices that lead to the kind of outcomes that we want? It just doesn't seem like, and I haven't seen very often that people get there without in some way engaging in that. So I don't know.
There,
That's a long-winded thing, but that was kind of like what this sparked in me.
yeah, there has to be hard collegiality. And I loved reading this chapter because I think I was ignorant to those terms prior to reading this chapter because I saw soft collegiality as polite and I saw hard as harsh.
Mhm.
Mm.
But the book describes soft collegiality, and any teacher will get this because it exists in school. Storytelling. You tell stories to each other about what's happened in your classroom or whatever. Sharing. Hey, I've got this great idea. You want to use it? Or assisting. Oh, let me help you with that. And then it describes hard collegiality as collaboration being at the core. So that shared dynamic of the individual and the group learning in concert. That's what they describe as hard collegiality. So, I always thought of it as like the polite teacher and the teacher that's giving harsh criticism as hard collegiality, but it's really hard collegiality is just that collaboration at the core, where it's that dynamics of you and the group in concert. Um, I just thought that was interesting and kind of shifted the way I thought about it.
I thought the
Mhm.
same thing, Laurie, and I want a new name for them because I
Yeah,
think most people assume.
yeah, yeah.
And we actually had one last slide. So I think it relates to what we're talking about. Teachers must invest time in building student skills for productive interaction early in the year by explicitly teaching and debriefing group interactions and developing communication skills. Communication skills are consistently rated the most important in-demand skills businesses seek in employees, so devoting time to developing them uh, is a worthwhile endeavor. And what routine scaffold tools can we use to build students' ability to confidently interact with others? But this is something we need to build in teachers too.
Yeah,
And I
it's
think that's what
true.
we're talking about, right? Like it's
Yeah.
it's one of the most, and maybe that's the point of frustration, is that it's, in my view, it's something that I consistently rate the most important and in-demand skill among teachers and among teaching communities that makes them so valuable for children and so valuable for being able to make these kind of impacts.
Agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
So given that this is a lesson, anything else that either of you would like to add before we?
I look at the question and we've definitely already answered that throughout all our other
Right,
slides.
exactly. Wonderful. So it sounds like there's nothing else to add, so we can wrap it up here then. Um, Again, I'm Francis Vigent. My colleagues Lori Colpoys and Judy Higgins. The book we were taking a look at today is Cultures of Thinking and Action by Ron Ritchhart, particular Mindset 6. Feel free to look at the other mindsets, which we've discussed in a similar manner, on KnowAtom.com. You can check on our blog and resources section. You can also check us out on X, formerly known as Twitter, at KnowAtom, and facebook.com/KnowAtom. Thank you again for your time, and we appreciate your participation today.